Hi, Rigsters here, back with another video on the F18. Today we're going to do a short takeoff, so let's get started. So based on feedback, I'm going to also denote some things that I skipped over, didn't look at on the takeoff, or prep for takeoff video. So here, this little guy right here next to Buno 165, this is your radar warning for altitude. Now I have this plane pretty hot started, so if you want to adjust this, you press and hold the knob, and you see this little chevron that moves when I move the mouse wheel while left click and holding. And also you see a red and green light. This is push in to test. Most people set this between 400 to as low as say like 50 feet. What this does is it gives you an audio warning of the radar altimeter detecting how close the ground is to your nose. It's very useful for carrier ops in bad weather and also for low level flight. And then when you let go, it verifies that the radar test is complete and also is actually your warning when you're here in your helmet. So we're going to go to the left side of the panel and take a look here. So before takeoff, you want to make sure your hook bypass is set to field if you're on shore. Your flaps usually are set to half by default, so I just want to make sure that is the case for takeoffs, and then once you get off the ground you set it up to auto. Preferences, if you like, you have your volume knobs lowered for WPN and RWR just behind the throttle. Get your left click drag or use the mouse wheel. In front of the nose, if you do a hot start on missions, make sure your radar warning receiver, this little guy right here, is powered on. Dispenser bypass is all the way up. And just take a look at your nose, make sure the HUD's on, your screens are on, and turn on your HMD if you like to have that on. So you either use the mouse wheel or you left click and drag the knob and do like a knob party, because I know some viewers love me doing moving knobs really fast for no reason. And lastly, as a preference, this is not required, on your HSI, your default bottom screen, which you can always change at will, if you press the mode button twice, you'll get this screen instead, which I much prefer. The color map's useful, but I have a preference of not using it. So what else do you want to do to make sure before you start taxiing is set your bingo fuel. Now by default, the plane will warn you that you run low on fuel at 2,000 pounds. I prefer 3,000. So how do you change that? Well, by the QTY button right here, there's an up and a down arrow. You can left click to do increments of 100, but I don't want to click that often. So if you press and hold the up arrow, it starts going up and it goes faster, and then you let go. You can set this to whatever value you want, but generally it's recommended that you might want to put it a little bit more to the default 2,000 depending on the mission. I prefer 3,000. That is a preference thing, not required, but it is useful. Another thing to check is on your IFF. You press that, so make sure it's still displaying there. The data link usually is switched off by default in the preloaded hot starts, so you press D/L, press on, press D/L again, and then press on. So now the data link is on, so that is good. So let's go and start rolling out here. So I'll hit right control enter to show my inputs. I prefer having that on. It's not required, but it is something I recommend to people if they like to see what their inputs are actually doing. The taxiway should be to the left. If I want to verify that it is, I press F10. And I use the mouse wheel to scroll in and out. I'm using the Russian symbol. That is an option in special you have to do on the home screen, which I can show if interested in a future video. It's not hard to do though, but you can't do it while you're playing the game, even in single player mode. So just verify that it is indeed on the left side of the field. I'm going to start taxiing there. So you just throttle up a little bit, and you use your rudder to steer. By default, the plane has normal nose wheel steering. And if you bound undesignate nose wheel steering high, you get even more control at low speeds. This is very useful for making really tight turns or if you're on a carrier. If you want to see what it looks like in option real quick, go to adjust controls and you make sure all but axis is shown up here. And in my case, I press a button on my VKB. Default for the keyboard is S, and you have to press and hold this button down if you want to use nose wheel steering high. It defaults to norm as soon as it's let go. The undesignate button is useful in the air for various air-to-air radar. And look to the left, and look to the right. There's not going to be any traffic, but if you're doing within visual road and more casual surfers, you generally want to visually look around before taxiing to the runway. I usually rely on F10 first and then I look left and right. So I would just get taxied to this, I would say to the right side of the runway. And I'll briefly explain what these knobs and stuff in front of your nose look like. So, if you want to know how fast you're going, this rectangular box by default will always show 48 on the ground until you actually go faster than 48 knots, which would be really crazy. You can't do it in a straight line. I wouldn't recommend going that fast, but it is something you can do. On the right hand box right here, this is your altimeter in barometric or radar. The default is usually should be barometric pressure, but I always want to check and verify that by the bottom here, where it says right here, the alt. So when it's flipped up, it's by barometric. If you flip it down, it will say R, and it'll say 0, because the radar is saying, hey, you're at 0 feet off the ground, and it'll blink. So we can flip that back up by left-clicking the ALT button, or knob, sorry, I'm so used to saying buttons. That's a knob. And in front of your nose here, we have a few things. We have this little guy right here, this circle with 2 rectangles, that is your velocity vector. Just above that, this 270, this is your compass heading or ticker tape. So if somebody says, oh, I would like to go to bearing 260, this is what they mean. For example, we're about near 269 for the bearing. This 5 with rectangular dotted lines is your pitch axis. This is 5 degrees down, and once the plane starts rolling, you're in the air, you'll see like a 5 degrees pitch up. So that is how much you're going in terms of angles, like 5 degrees or more. Alright, so with that out of the way, you want to hold the brakes, move your throttle up, keep holding the brakes till you're about 80, which is right here. It might be a little imprecise with not so great throttles, but you can get it to about 80. This is just to verify that there's any warning lights or any issues. Usually you would see like warning lights here, or sometimes on the DDIs. They're not called MFDs. I actually learned that from a week ago, that these screens are not called MFDs, even though it's basically the same function. They're called DDIs on the Hornet. Okay, everything looks good. So we release the brakes, and then we gently idle the throttle up to, let's do a mil power takeoff, which is just before afterburner. You see the plane starts going down the runway. So around 140 knots, when you're lightly loaded, you gently pull back the stick and go to, like, say, a 5 degree climb. Press the letter G to retract the landing gear, default on the keyboard. You'll see the landing gear flap handle will glow, and set the flaps to auto once you have a good rate of climb. Because if it's looking down at that, this is a very important thing to denote that you can very easily crash into the ground when you're staring at this. Flip that to auto, and now your plane is airborne. I'll quick pause the sim here. So I'd like to denote one thing under controls here. Because I was looking down at the flaps thing, which you should never do while taking off. That was just to purposely demonstrate what not to do. You want to bind your flip switch up and down at the very least. The default keyboard commands are left Alt left shift F for up, left Alt left control F for down. I usually prefer and recommend if you have buttons on your joystick or hold test, as they call, on 2 buttons, so that way you can just glance at it and cycle through instead of just staring at it. Because my keyboard is very close to me, I don't usually have an issue with the landing gear controlled handle. I just was trying to show that for your benefit. But it is recommended, but not required, that you should bind the landing gear control handle up/down if you find the keyboard's too far away, or if you're using VR, or different control bindings. That's what makes this game great, is that you can customize it to whatever you want. You don't have to use all these default bindings. And that out of the way, hope you enjoyed this video. That's pretty much it for very basic no weapons takeoff. If you're playing this loaded heavier, you may want to do between 150 to 170 knots before gently pulling the nose back at around 5 to 7 degrees pitch up climb. You may need to use afterburner, so your plane accelerates much quicker over time, so you have to be ready to catch the plane. One last thing to note for landing gear is you want to retract your landing gear before this left rectangular box indicates 250. If you wait too late, you'll break the gear doors, and then your weapons, for the most part, will not work because it's weight on wheels, meaning that it thinks there's weight on the ground, so the weapons will not arm or track. So this is Rigsters Journey, signing off.